We're going to begin our studies with some definitions of exactly what we mean by risk, and looking at different aspects of what we mean by risk. Seems sensible to start with that before we get into how we manage those risks. So for this first video, we're going to be having a look at lots and lots of definitions. It's a good place to start though. So first of all, fundamental risks. Fundamental risks are risks that affect the world at large. They might include, for example, things like natural disasters and atmospheric conditions, for example. Although those are beyond the control of any one individual, a fundamental concept we have to get straight right from the start is that it doesn't mean that we can therefore just say, well, there's nothing we can do about that. Let's just carry on regardless. You might not be able to control a risk, you might not be able to stop it from happening, but what you can affect is how you are affected by it, because you can take steps to minimize your exposure, for example, to pollution or to natural disasters. So fundamental risks, those big sort of risks that are out there beyond the control of anyone in particular. Then you have particular risks, which are, as the name suggests, a lot more specific. An individual probably has an element of influence over those particular risks. So that's the kind of thing where we can take some direct action to reduce the chances of that risk happening in the first place. So, for example, if we are using a certain type of technology, then that will expose us to the particular risks associated with that technology. And if we decide that those particular risks are just too much for us to bear, then we could stop using that technology and use something else instead. Speculative risk is risks that we take on by being in business. And we naturally tend to think of risk as being downside, as being bad stuff could happen. And to be honest, that is normally the way we're thinking about it in this subject. But strictly speaking, all risk means is that we don't know what the future holds with certainty. It could be better or it could be worse than we think. And a speculative risk has upside and downside. That's the kind of risk that we acquire by investing in business. We take money out of a relatively safe bank account and we invest it in a relatively risky business in the hope of making returns that are in excess of what we could get on a bank account. But things could always go wrong. So a speculative risk can be upside or downside depending on which way it goes. That's as opposed to a pure risk. With a pure risk, there's only downside, only bad things that can happen. So for example, your computer's falling flat and you losing data and having disruption to operations. I can't really think of any potential upside for that, apart from perhaps a day off for somebody, but there aren't really any potential upsides for that. So that would be what's known as a pure risk. The only outcome is bad, and that's the stuff that we want to try and get rid of in business. And it's the speculative risk that we want to maintain within the business and manage it to the right sort of level. So although risk can be upside and downside, we are generally asking what could possibly go wrong in this paper. When we identify risk formally, the first stage of that is to say what could possibly go wrong. That's a very, very broad question. If you just sit back and say what could possibly go wrong today, you'd never get started in the morning. So it's a difficult starting point for businesses when they're trying to formally manage their risks, to try and work out exactly what could go wrong, what do they need to be aware of when they're putting their risk management processes together. And there are various things that we can do to try and come up with this list as a starting point. One of the things is to use standard checklists, and that's what we're going to have a quick look at here. There are other things we could do. We could call in industry experts to find out, what else is likely to go wrong in our industry. We could benchmark ourselves to the competition and see what's gone wrong for them. We could ask management, senior management, junior management, what they've seen go wrong and what they think could go wrong. But one of the tools we have at our disposal, as I say, is to use formal categorizations of risk. And a simple method is to split risks between strategic and operational. Now, strategic risks are to do with the big picture, long-term sort of direction of the business as it navigates its way through the environment, and the fact that things could go wrong because of the environment. For example, our product may fail to be attractive to consumers, or it could fall out of favour. Competition could produce something better than we're producing at the moment, and that would be a particular type of business risk, a particular type of strategic risk called a business risk. Now, business risks tend to be related to the product themselves and the fact that our profits could be higher or lower as a result of a product selling more or less than plan, or costs being more or less than plan. Strategic risks can also be non-business in nature, though, not directly related to the product itself and what the business does for a living. Financial risk comes about by virtue of the way in which we're financed. So you could put in there the proportion of debt to equity. If we have more debt, then we have to service that debt, which puts us under a bit of strain as a business. Or there's event risk, something catastrophic could happen in the environment, for example, fire and flood, those kinds of things that could damage businesses' performance. So that's strategic type risks. Operational risks are more to do with day-to-day operations, and there's a tendency for people to think that operational risk is just in some way not as important as strategic, because strategic is to do with all the big picture type stuff. But that's absolutely not the case, because the thing with operational risk is that if, for example, your computers grind to a halt, then business stops suddenly there and then. And if it is a prolonged downtime, then that will very quickly start to affect the longer term reputation and standing of the business. So operational risks can give birth to strategic risks relatively quickly. So they are important to keep on top of, even though they are to do with more day-to-day operations. And that could be to do with your IT systems, as we've mentioned just there, maybe compliance with regulations, so particularly if you're in a regulated industry like banking or something like that, for example. Wastage, so if something goes wrong in the production process and you end up wasting a lot of money. Reputation and ethics. It's debatable as to how operational that is versus strategic, but we are going to find this quite often in this subject, that the real world of risks is a very, very complicated world, and we try and put order onto that with relatively simple models. And you know what? The real world does not necessarily want to fit into simple models. So categorizing things exactly is not is never going to be a precise science. We have fraud risk, so the chance that someone might run away with some or all of our money as a business. And then health and safety concerns, the risk of accidents, for example, in the workplace. So using a list like that, you can run your way through that list to try and at least identify what you think could go wrong. Now, this is it's a very broad, wide open process to start with, but as you get into it, it will start to take shape. So as you start to think in these terms as an organisation, the next step will then be to think, well, which ones of these risks are more serious than others? And then it starts to take a little bit of shape. But we'll come back to that a little bit later on.